I've learned many things in the last 20 years, and I've learned this. If Al Gore's involved, it's a scam. End of story. Of course they give him the Oscar for his rubbish, ludicrous documentary. Of course he gets the Nobel bloody Peace Prize, because the people that want this thing out there control who gets those things. And we have, oh, you know, if it's a scam, Madonna's singing on the bloody stage as well, it seems to me. This is the great Earth concerts around the world, selling alive. These people do no research. And here's the global warming survival handbook for those live Earth concerts, written by David de Rothschild. The carbon con. We are being sold one of the most blatant lies, at least of modern times, and probably more. Greenhouse effect. Oh, it doesn't let heat out, so the planet warms, and it's the greenhouse gases, and it's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has become the enemy, the villain. Without carbon dioxide, first of all, in the greenhouse effect, the planet would be too cold for any life, and nothing would bloody grow without carbon dioxide, and we've turned it into the great bloody evil. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in relationship to other greenhouse gases is fractional, and the amount produced by human technology is a tiny, tiny fraction of that fraction. The idea that it's changing the climate of the planet is insane. This guy, James Hansen, who's a close associate of Al Gore, from NASA, he has been exposed for making up temperature changes to make them seem higher than they are by changing the months around to make 1 month seem to be really warm when it shouldn't be, when it was taken from a month which was just a normal temperature. And this is what one of his colleagues says, like he's a close associate of Al Gore, one of his colleagues at NASA. Hansen was never muzzled, even though he violated NASA's official agency position on climate forecasting, i.e. we didn't know enough to forecast climate change or mankind's effect on it. Hansen thus embarrassed NASA by coming out with his claims of global warming in 1988 in his testimony before Congress. Nothing happened because he was supposed to do that. And this guy from NASA, John Theon, also goes on about Gore. Gore faces a much different scientific climate in 2009 than the one he faced in 2006 when his film An Inconvenient Truth was released. According to satellite data, the Earth has cooled since Gore's film was released. Antarctic sea ice extent has grown to record levels. Sea level rise has slowed. Ocean temperatures have failed to warm. And more scientists have publicly declared their dissent from man-made climate fears as peer-reviewed studies continue to man-made counter-warming fears. This very week, this world expert in sea level rise has said, despite fluctuations down as well as up, the sea is not rising. It hasn't risen in 50 years. And quite apart from examining the hard evidence, the elementary laws of physics, latent heat needed to melt ice, tells us that the apocalypse conjured up by Al Gore and company couldn't possibly come about. And this is interesting too. He said this, the same man. When asked to act as an expert reviewer on the International Panel of Climate Change's last two reports, he was astonished to find that not one of their 22 contributing authors on sea levels was a sea level specialist, not one. Yet the results of all this deliberate ignorance, absolutely, and reliance on rigged computer models have become the most powerful single driver of the entire warmist hysteria.
This book was written and produced by the producer of Al Gore's movie. What she did was to switch the captions on the graphs for temperature and CO2 going back 650,000 years so that she could show that it was CO2 that had changed first and temperature that had followed, when the unanimous opinion of the scientific literature, by a very simple series of measurements, shows that it was exactly the other way around. It was temperature that had always changed first and CO2 had followed. CO2. CO2 now occupies, get this, 1/10,000th more of the atmosphere than it did in 1750. That is all, 1/10,000th. And if we try really hard and don't cut down our CO2 emissions, we might be able to occupy another 1/2000th part of the atmosphere in the whole of the next 100 years. That is all. Look on now at the history of temperature, then going back 650 million years, 550 million years, back to the Cambrian era, 550 million years ago. Oh yes, I remember it well. And at that time, I remember this, CO2 concentration was 20 times what it is today. So then we have a little experiment for you to do. I want you to squint at this screen now through your lashes. Which bits can you see? The white bits. Those are the clouds. They reflect light back into space. If the planet were to warm, you'd get more clouds and more light reflected back into space, wouldn't you? Yes, you would. So the UN says the opposite would happen, that the Earth would heat up because you'd get more radiation coming down in there. And there is no scientific basis for that conclusion. 2,500 IPCC scientists lie. The IPCC, this is the UN's climate panel, it says that 2,500 scientists participated in this dismal report they've just produced in 2007. Al Gore last week in Madison, Wisconsin, inflated that to 4,000. The number of scientists who actually contributed to the crucial chapter of that report, which says that most of the warming of the last 50 years was our fault, was 50. The guy who runs the science panel of the UN's climate panel, is he a climatologist? Nope. Is he a physicist? Nope. Is he a mathematician? Nope. He is a railroad engineer. So we have removed his railroad lines from this graph, and we've added his lordship's much grander purple lines. And you'll see they all run in parallel. And what that means is that the warming rates from 1860 to 1880 and from 1910 to 1940 are exactly the same as the warming rate from 1975 until 1995, when all global warming stopped, and there hasn't been any since. So there is no anthropogenic signal whatsoever in the temperature record, just as the scientists correctly concluded in 1995 before the IPCC, the UN's climate panel, rewrote their paper. Now some lies from the UN's climate panel itself, because it's all very well poking fun at Al Gore, but he's now, frankly, just a bit of a joke. But now we get on to the serious business. This is the body which is supposed to be representing the true facts about the science to the world. But of course it's not. It's just another vested interest lobby group. The first thing they did was, in 1995, Ken Overpeck talked to David Deming, a scientist who's expert in reconstructing past temperatures, who'd had a paper successfully published in Science for the first time. Overpeck congratulated him. Deming told the story 10 years later. And he said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Now, Overpeck is one of the UN's scientists. We have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Not we have to check whether there was one, check how big it was, check where it happened and where it didn't. No, we have to get rid of it. And here is how they did it. There you will see the 1990 UN report's graph. I've colorized it a bit. I've spelt medieval correctly, but otherwise I've left it alone. And you will see the medieval warm period up there on the left, a kind of camel's hump. It's very clear. You can see the little ice age in the middle there, and then a tiny little pimple on the right, which is today's temperatures. Not exactly an exciting picture. But they were quite honest in the 1990 report. There was the medieval warm period. But then, 1995, Overpeck comes along and says, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. Here is what they did by 2001. Same graph, but this time, no medieval bump. And look what has happened to temperature in the 20th century. A huge surge. How have they done that? Notice the small words, northern hemisphere temperatures. They left out the southern hemisphere, because if they had, they wouldn't have been able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century, as they've done on this graph. So the double lie in this graph: one, no medieval warm period when everybody knows it exists and the science is clear on that. Two, they were able to exaggerate by 50% the warming of the 20th century. Here's how they did it. First of all, they said, right, we're going to use what are called proxy data sets. These are things like tree rings and sediments from lakes, and we're going to analyze them and see whether the width of the tree rings vary and so forth. We reconstruct temperatures before instruments were available to measure them. And what they did was every time they found a data set that gave them a hockey stick-shaped curve with a nice flat shank going back 1,000 years and then a huge uptick in the 20th century, they said to themselves, we'll give that 390 times as much weighting as we will give to those data sets which show the inconvenient truth that there wasn't this huge surge in the 20th century like the one at the bottom there. Both of those, incidentally, are tree ring data. 390 times as much weighting for the one that suited them as for the one that didn't. That was the first thing they did. Then they used an algorithm for processing all these data sets, a computer program for plotting the graph, which would draw hockey stick-shaped graphs even if you put random red noise into it. That's a kind of random data. Not even the real data, just random data. It would always produce that convenient shape for them which abolished the medieval warm period and exaggerated the warming of the 20th century. But that wasn't enough. Even when they tried both those techniques, the trouble was the medieval warm period kept on still showing up. So then what they did was, if you look at the faint line there, you can see that's what their data would have showed. They tried to remove the actual data for the medieval warm period from certain key data sets. They replaced it with estimates of their own that removed that inconvenient medieval warm period, and they didn't say in the paper that they published in Nature that that was what they'd done. Instead, they said they'd used the actual proxy data. So they actually lied. So we move on then to the consensus lie. You are told time and again, aren't you, that unless we do something drastic about the climate, then there will be disasters, plagues, boils, pustules, frogs, toads, something out of one of the Psalms. That's what you hear. The scientists are all agreed. Al Gore said it again last week. No scientist, he says, disagrees with me. So I checked. I'm boring that way. I keep checking things. That's what scientists do. That's what Al Haytham said we should do. I check them. So I got a colleague who had access to the ISI Web of Science database, a very distinguished scientist, called Klaus Martin Schulte in London, to search all papers published between the beginning of 2004 and the beginning of 2007 using the search term global climate change. 539 papers were identified on that subject. It's a good way of choosing papers randomly. He read them all. And here is the number of papers offering evidence, any evidence at all, of any catastrophe arising from any anthropogenic effect on any part of the climate anywhere in the world. Yep, 0. That's the consensus. Now we come on to a lie in the 1995 report, and this is one of the most extraordinary lies of the lot. Time and again, the scientists in that report said, we cannot find any anthropogenic or human signal in the climate record. We are having no effect on temperature as far as we can see. They said it 5 times very clearly. Here's one sample of it, here's another, and now watch this. Here is what the bureaucrats did. They rewrote the final draft, yet again, after it had been cleared and signed off by the scientists, to say the exact opposite. The body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on climate, and that has been the official line ever since.
Yet, as the frenzy over man-made global warming grows shriller, many senior climate scientists say the actual scientific basis for the theory is crumbling.
There were periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory.
This morning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made up of...
It is presented in the media as having the stamp of authority of an impressive international organisation.
From the IPCC,
the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
The IPCC, like any UN body, is political. The final conclusions are politically driven.
This claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists. You look at the bibliographies of the people and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
To the Wall Street Journal, Professor Frederick Seitz, former president of America's National Academy of Sciences, revealed that IPCC officials had censored the comments of scientists. He said that
this report is not the version that was approved by the contributing scientists.
At least 15 key sections of the science chapter had been deleted. These included statements like,
"None of the studies cited has shown clear evidence that we can attribute climate changes to increases in greenhouse gases. No study to date has positively attributed all or part of the observed climate changes to man-made causes."
Professor Seitz concluded,
"I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report."
In its reply, the IPCC did not deny making these deletions, but it said there was no dishonesty or bias in the report and that uncertainties about the cause of global warming had been included. The changes had been made, it said, in response to comments from governments, individual scientists, and non-governmental organizations.
When I resigned from the IPCC, I thought that was the end of it. But when I saw the final draft, my name was still there, so I asked for it to be removed. Well, they told me that I had contributed, so it would remain there. So I said, no, I haven't contributed because they haven't listened to anything I've said. So in the end, it was quite a battle. But finally, I threatened legal action against them, and they removed my name. And I think this happens a great deal. Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
We hear constantly in the media, we hear on a variety of different formats, in the news media as well as on specials. Al Gore just produced his video, The Inconvenient Truth. He reaffirms time and time and time again in that video that there is no longer any debate. It's a settled science. Well, folks, it's not a settled science by any stretch of the imagination. Mr. Gore, the United Nations uses this information to prove that Earth's CO2 and temperature are highly correlated. And they are right. However, a high correlation proves nothing. To give an extreme example, there is a 100% correlation that any human that breathes air will die. But that does not prove that breathing air kills people. Far from it. We would all die if we didn't breathe air. But even the correlation used by Mr. Gore in the United Nations is misleading. Notice they kept the two graphs separate. By doing so, the human eye perceives that CO2 causes temperature to rise. However, when the temperature graph is superimposed over the CO2 graph, it becomes apparent that CO2 tends to follow temperature, not precede it, strongly suggesting that the CO2 does not cause the temperature to change, but the temperature causes CO2 to change. The global warming issue is a farce. Global warming is occurring, don't get me wrong, but it's not caused by man.
The worst reason for the change in the climate, it's not CO2, that's rubbish. Yeah. But of course, to spread rubbish, you get a Nobel Prize because people believe what mass media is telling you.
So you don't believe in global warming. I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
Each day, the news reports grow more fantastically apocalyptic. Politicians no longer dare to express any doubt about climate change. Professor Ian Clarke is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clarke and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
But how can it be that higher temperatures lead to more CO2 in the atmosphere? To understand this, we must first restate the obvious point that carbon dioxide is a natural gas produced by all living things.
Few things annoy me more than to hear people talking about carbon dioxide as being a pollutant. You're made of carbon dioxide. I'm made of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is how living things grow.
What's more, humans are not the main source of carbon dioxide.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans. Carl Wunsch is Professor of Oceanography at MIT. He was also visiting Professor in Oceanography at Harvard University and University College London, and a Senior Visiting Fellow in Mathematics and Physics at the University of Cambridge. He is the author of 4 major textbooks on oceanography.
The ocean is the major reservoir into which carbon dioxide goes when it comes out of the atmosphere, or from which it is re-emitted to the atmosphere. If you heat the surface of the ocean, it tends to emit carbon dioxide. So similarly, if you cool the ocean surface, the ocean can dissolve more carbon dioxide.
So the warmer the oceans, the more carbon dioxide they produce, and the cooler they are, the more they suck in. But why is there a time lag of hundreds of years between a change in temperature and a change in the amount of carbon dioxide going into or out of the sea? The reason is that oceans are so big and so deep They take literally hundreds of years to warm up and cool down. This time lag means the oceans have what scientists call a memory of temperature changes.
The ocean has a memory of past events running out as far as 10,000 years. So, for example, if somebody says, oh, I'm seeing changes in the North Atlantic, this must mean that the climate system is changing. It may only mean that something happened in a remote part of the ocean decades or hundreds of years ago, whose effects are now beginning to show up in the North Atlantic.
The current warming began long before people had cars or electric lights. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over half a degree Celsius. But most of that rise occurred before 1940. Since that time, the temperature has fallen for 4 decades and risen for 3. There is no evidence at all from Earth's long climate history that carbon dioxide has ever determined global temperatures.
CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even.
210 billion metric tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere each year. Humans contribute only 6.3 billion tons, or about 3%. Other sources like vegetation, soils, and the ocean dwarf the amount produced by man. The importance of carbon dioxide is diminished even further by the never-mentioned fact that the overwhelming majority of all greenhouse gases is water vapor and clouds. Water vapor comprises approximately 97% of all greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide comprises less than 2%, and the balance is made up of methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide. Many proponents of man-caused global warming claim that water vapor is highly variable across the Earth and from season to season, and therefore is unimportant. Additionally, they claim that CO2 has far greater potential as a greenhouse gas than a small amount would otherwise indicate. While there is some truth in these claims, water vapor remains the dominant greenhouse gas. The effectiveness or potential of greenhouse gases is highly variable due to a host of reasons. At any one time, water vapor accounts for 36 to 70% of the total greenhouse gas effects. If clouds are included, it jumps to 66 to 86%. Carbon dioxide comes in a distant third by accounting for only 9 to 27%. And remember, man's activities accounts for less than 3% of the total carbon dioxide, so at a maximum, man is responsible for less than 1% of all the potential greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Elevated levels of carbon dioxide may not be as harmful as Al Gore and other man-caused global warming proponents would have us believe. In fact, there is strong evidence that elevated carbon dioxide may be very beneficial, something that we are never told.
I mean, CO2 has been part of the planetary atmosphere since the first day this Earth evolved. And the plants and virtually everything we see evolved in a period of time when the CO2 level was very much higher than it is today. CO2 is something the plants love. They take up CO2, they use it, they give out oxygen. We take the oxygen and give out CO2. So it's hardly a pollutant at all. It's quite a naturally occurring gas that appears in our atmosphere and is very important to sustaining life on this Earth.
In terms of the broad geological perspective, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere right now is low. Almost all the plants that we live with and depend upon for food evolved in an atmosphere when the CO2 was higher in the atmosphere, much higher than it is today, and higher than we could possibly get it even if we tried.
Well, as a matter of fact, there were times when life flourished on Earth. The time when CO2 levels were something like 10 times current levels was when the dinosaurs were running around.
When we've looked at the literature on experiments that have been done with increasing levels of carbon dioxide, what we basically find is that most plants respond the same way. More carbon dioxide gives us more biomass. So if we look at a forest, a rangeland, a marsh, a wetland, or an agricultural field, what's really happening with more CO2 is that you have more plant material produced.
Increased CO2 worldwide, with few exceptions, means plants grow better, period.
We grow vegetables at 2 till 4 times the outside carbon dioxide level.
Okay, research has shown that increases of CO2 concentration of 2, 3, 4, 5 times would not have a detrimental effect upon the Earth's biosphere.
We go up to about 1,500 parts per million that has no negative effect on human health. To get negative effects on human health, you have to go much higher. That's higher than 5 and 10,000 parts per million, at least. Looking at rising levels of CO2 from the viewpoint of the plant, that's no problem at all. We will have a higher production.
The evidence that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to cause a disaster is somewhere between slim and none. However, the evidence that it's doing a good thing by lengthening the growing season and making plants grow better is somewhere between large